Estamos esperando la conexión de streaming. Sí, las colegas de comunicaciones. ¿Listo? Buen día a todas y todos. Hace pocos meses atrás se conmemoraron 50 años del golpe militar contra la democracia chilena el 11 de septiembre de 1973. Aquel acontecimiento acrecentó la avalancha y la coordinación de varios gobiernos dictatoriales en el cono sur de América Latina. El asesinato, la tortura, la desaparición y el exilio de miles de ciudadanos latinoamericanos durante más de una década gestó también el largo y complejo camino de la resistencia, la restauración de la democracia y la lucha civil por los derechos humanos en nuestra región. Desde esa profunda cesura política y social, que produjo entre tantos cambios significativos la fundación de esta sede México de la FLACSO, la cual arribará a sus 50 años en 2025, los coordinadores del Seminario de Sociología e Historia Cultural de esta facultad, los doctores Santiago Carazale Real, Nelson Arteaga Botello y yo, propusimos la realización de la Cátedra FLACSO México, Pasado y Presente del Autoritarismo en América Latina. La primera parte de la cátedra, coordinada por la doctora Soledad Lastra, el doctor Santiago y yo, entre noviembre del 2023 y abril de este año, presentó 4 conferencias magistrales a cargo de investigadoras e investigadores especializados en un eje temático centrado en un tiempo pasado-presente que titulamos Autoritarismos, Dictaduras y Resistencia en América Latina a 50 años de los golpes de Estado en el Cono Sur. Hoy comienza la segunda parte de la cátedra, coordinada por el doctor Nelson, orientada desde la misma temática, pero con la mirada puesta en un tiempo presente-futuro. Como su título sugiere, la esfera civil y las tendencias autoritarias en las democracias. Sin más, para inaugurar esta segunda parte de la Cátedra FLACSO México, doy la palabra primero a la doctora Gloria Del Castillo Alemán, directora general de la FLACSO México, y luego al doctor Nelson Arteaga Botello, coordinador de este segundo ciclo de conferencias magistrales.
Muchas gracias, Liliana. Yo oigo un poco de eco, no sé si se oye, pero bueno. Pues buenos días a todas y todos y todos los que aquí nos acompañan de manera presencial y también a distancia. Tenemos un público numeroso que nos acompaña. Les quiero dar la más cordial bienvenida a nuestra institución, a la Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales, sede México, que efectivamente el año que entra cumplimos nuestros primeros 50 años. Agradezco mucho a Liliana Martínez, igual al doctor Santiago Carazale, a la doctora Liliana Martínez y al doctor Nelson Arteaga, haber tenido la iniciativa de organizar esta serie de conferencias en torno a la democracia. Esto se ha hecho en torno a un espacio que hemos creado en la FLACSO México, que se llama la Cátedra FLACSO México, con el propósito de dialogar, debatir, conversar, construir, repensar, ¿no? conceptos básicos de las ciencias sociales, pero a la luz, ¿no? de la solución de grandes problemas públicos complejos a nivel global, regional, nacional y local. También quiero agradecer de manera muy importante, y bueno, sentimos mucho que no puede estar aquí con nosotros el doctor Jeffrey Alexander, pero bueno, nos da mucho gusto verlo bien aquí a la distancia, y por supuesto también agradecer que aquí nos acompañan los ponentes, conferencistas para estos 2 días de jornada de diálogo y debate sobre este tema. Agradezco que esté aquí Celso Villegas, de Kenyon College. También nos acompaña, ya lo decía Jeffrey Alexander, también nos acompaña Carlos Donato y Peter Kibisco. Muchas gracias de verdad por estar aquí. Además, que estén presencialmente para la FLACSO México, para nuestra comunidad, es muy importante porque esta cátedra, que es muy joven, apenas la creamos en noviembre del 2020, la hemos hecho pues prácticamente a la distancia. Fue creada en la pandemia y digamos que para que tuviera mayor éxito continuamos con este modelo a distancia, y hoy la verdad que a iniciativa del doctor Nelson Arteaga es que se ha hecho de manera presencial. Igualmente me da mucho gusto ver aquí a las y los estudiantes de la FLACSO México, a nuestros colegas, profesoras y profesores. Y bueno, como ya lo decía Liliana Martínez, ha sido una cátedra que ha sido organizada en dos partes. La primera, bien lo decía Liliana, estuvo focalizada, digamos, en el origen, ¿no?, histórico, político de las dictaduras en el cono sur, y esta segunda parte, que es organizada particularmente por el doctor Nelson Arteaga, pues está orientada, ¿no?, desde una perspectiva más sociológica, politológica, no sé si incluso antropológica, ¿no?, la democracia y sus vínculos con la esfera social. Creo que además, por la coyuntura que vive México, viene muy bien hoy estar aquí, ¿no? Desde muy temprano tuvimos elecciones federales, locales, nacionales, tuvimos todas tipo de elecciones, así que pues muchas gracias nuevamente a todas y todos por estar aquí. Muchas gracias, Liliana, nuevamente Santiago, muchas gracias por esta organización, y Nelson, pues por supuesto, muchas gracias también. Así que adelante.
Gracias a todas y a todos por estar aquí. Voy a leer un muy pequeño documento para dar marco al inicio de los trabajos. Agradecer a la doctora Gloria Del Castillo el apoyo para la realización de este evento. Thank you, Celso, Peter, Jeff, thank you very much. Carlo, I send you my works in English to your emails. Well, bien, como todos sabemos, ayer hubo elecciones en México para elegir alcaldes, diputados, senadores, algunos gobernadores y principalmente el presidente de la República. La elección estuvo pautada por la polarización política bajo el modo populista de gobernar del actual presidente de la República. El resultado electoral parece dar, bueno, no parece, ya dio, es que esto lo escribí antes, ¿no? Parece dar, ¿no? Y tengo que decirles que hice 2 discursos, ¿no? Entonces voy a leer el discurso 1, no el 2, ¿no? Para que vean que soy prevenido, puedo hacer entonces aquí decía, para darle el triunfo a Claudia Sheinbaum, Xochitl Gálvez, en realidad es para Claudia Sheinbaum, ¿no? Entonces pasaré a leer el párrafo correspondiente. Para algunos, esto significa que la sociedad apostó por continuar con una política de reparación civil de los grupos menos privilegiados frente a los más privilegiados, favoreciendo a aquellos que poseen las virtudes civiles frente a aquellos marcados por el vicio civil. El triunfo de Sheinbaum representa, para otros, que el electorado decidió desmontar las instituciones democráticas y reforzar la capacidad autoritaria de la presidencia a cambio de garantizar la continuidad de los programas sociales. Ciertamente este seminario no tiene como objetivo entender lo que sucedió ayer en el país, ni tampoco construir escenarios sobre lo que va a suceder. No obstante, lo que aquí discutiremos nos ayudará a entender cómo la teoría de la esfera civil arroja luz sobre los procesos que amplían los mecanismos de inclusión social, que disparan sobre los procesos de frontlash que amplían los mecanismos de inclusión social y de backlash que disparan las respuestas autoritarias en las democracias. En otras palabras, vamos a reflexionar sobre las estructuras de sentido e institucionales detrás de la construcción, la destrucción y la reconstrucción de la solidaridad civil, tanto en las llamadas democracias consolidadas como las de reciente creación. La teoría de la esfera civil ha mostrado ser una poderosa herramienta de interpretación para entender las disputas simbólicas que pautan la expansión y la construcción de la solidaridad civil. La teoría de la esfera civil considera que ninguna sociedad es y no será nunca una democracia pura, pero la mayor parte de las sociedades tienen a la democracia como horizonte a alcanzar. Por tanto, para entender las particularidades de una democracia, se requiere ubicar el presente en términos de la historia profunda de cada país. En esa reconstrucción histórica se pueden encontrar tanto los esfuerzos colectivos por construir formas de inclusión y la solidaridad ampliadas y restringidas, como los procesos de frontlash y backlash endémicos a la vida democrática. Como sugiere Alexander, la democracia democracy depends on feeling of mutual regard, on experiencing and shared solidarity, despite the deep antipathies of interest and ideology. La teoría de la esfera civil se enfoca a analizar cómo los sentimientos mutuos de solidaridad se traducen en medios de comunicación, las encuestas, como vimos en México, las asociaciones civiles. De igual forma, subraya cómo el hecho de votar, los conflictos entre partidos, el cargo, son esenciales en la construcción de la solidaridad y va más allá de una mera fuerza persuasiva, porque permiten también el acceso a la ley. En años recientes, la esfera civil en distintos contextos nacionales se ha visto afectada por un backlash que se expresa en variantes populistas de izquierda y derecha, hasta el punto de que realmente la amenaza, generando la sensación de que la sociedad se está fracturando. Los trabajos que se presentarán en estos 2 días tratarán estos temas de una manera que alertan sobre los riesgos que enfrentan las democracias. Por ejemplo, cómo el poder civil se transforma en poder social con el populismo, cómo las tácticas partidistas llevan a las dictaduras dentro del Estado, cómo la denuncia de los dobles estándares morales de los actores sociales mina la vida civil y cómo se construyen los autócratas modernos. En estos análisis no solo existe una visión pesimista, muestran también, y ese es mi deseo más profundo, la capacidad del poder civil para erosionar las tendencias autoritarias que enfrentan hoy en día las democracias. Muchísimas gracias.
Bravo.
Empezamos. Evelyn, please.
Pues bueno, ¿me esperan? No, bueno, okay. El azulito. Gracias. Ahora sí, ya comenzamos. Bueno, me pidieron que esta parte va a ser en inglés, entonces voy a cambiar la lengua en este momento. Entonces, let's begin with the first speaker of this session, who is Celso Villegas, professor of sociology of Kenyon College, who will start now with his presentation. So we hear you. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you to Nelson and to Profesora Del Castillo for inviting us. I wish I could speak Spanish better than I do, but I'm very grateful to the FLACSO system. I was a researcher at FLACSO Ecuador in 2007 when I studied the Rebelión de los Forajidos a long time ago. So I appreciate the mission of the network of the FLACSO institutions. So thanks for inviting me here today. So my paper is trying to capture two things that I think civil sphere theory can contribute to for the understanding of authoritarianism. And I'm going to use the Philippines under Rodrigo Duterte as an illustrative case of a kind of frustrating civil sphere phenomenon where certain kinds of criticism help to reinforce authoritarian politics. So I'm going to use insights from Weberian charismatic authority, and I want to show how social power comes to undermine the functioning of the civil sphere. And I'm going to focus particularly on what Paul Giussi calls incredulous onlookers among the media, among the international organizations that criticize Duterte and his government for making brash statements and for the extrajudicial killings associated with the drug war. And in his response, the deployment of state violence, defending extrajudicial killings through bureaucratic language, by detaining political opponents and courting incredulity in the international arena, it creates the context for charismatic proof. And so I want to show how that slides social power into the functioning of democracies, that it begins to undermine it. So civil sphere theory has always been positioned in an opposite way to theories of civil society and theories of democracy that center or reduce action to economic interest or will to power. The binary codes of the civil sphere form the moral core of how members of collectivities understand each other as worthy of inclusion, but civil sphere theory extends this Durkheimian point with an updated form of Weberian institutional realism. Jeff writes, democracy rests on the independent production of a new kind of power, which he calls civil power. And it's located in the regulatory institutions of the civil sphere, political office, political party, and law. Right? Civil sphere or civil power open and closes the gate to the state, meaning that in democracies, access to the force and bureaucratic capacities of modern states runs through the vote, the obligations of elected and bureaucratic office, and through the structures of law. The opposite of civil power is social power. In civil sphere theory, economic interests and will to power are mediated, channeled, surrounded by civil power by those institutions. And such a translation can be blocked, Alexander writes, and the ability to affect such blockages, indeed to institutionalize it in a systematic manner, is how democracy should be defined. Hence, the more dangerous forms of populism attempt to and do tend to undermine the very regulatory institutional systems put into place to hem in these extra organizational forces. Alexander is quick to note that social power does not disappear in the civil sphere, but rather he questions whether it is, quote, always and inevitably becomes political power. And the point, he says, is not that democracies, that civil power ceases to exist, but rather it is more effectively mediated when civil spheres are more developed or autonomous, expansive, et cetera, et cetera. There isn't a very clear definition of what social power is, though I think someone above me will fight me on this. But it may include things like Michael Mann's forms of social power, ideological, military, economic, and political. But all this to say that civil power surrounds these forms of interest and channels them through office, voting, and law. But what does it feel like when civil power weakens and social power begins to dictate the norms of politics? That's the question. What's the felt sense, especially during populist moments, when the civil sphere is not exercising mediating power? And typically, understanding populism is focused on a leader-follower dynamic with attraction that does appear between leaders and followers, no matter how intense, does not account for the feelings against those leaders and followers as well. And through contentious speeches and rallies, would-be populist leaders push and pull on the codes of the civil sphere, sometimes performing against them. And indeed, it makes sense to say that populist performance is not about high fidelity to democratic codes or existing codes, but rather how leaders and audiences outside of the relationship between leader and follower come to expect some kind of counter-performance. And there's a dramatic tension of audiences and performers seeing whether or not this person can pull off their audacity, okay? And that attracts everyone. Dmitry Kuryakin calls this a form of emotional attraction, perhaps something that you have to see to believe. And so to watch a speech or a rally, even if you're not a follower, you want to know whether or not this person's actually going to do the things that they say. Okay. And so this brings us to Paul Giussi's amazing rereading of Weber and his description of a variety of non-devotional actors that contribute to the interactional ecology that favors the proliferation of charismatic sentiments, he says. Among these are unworthy challengers who become reference points for the strength of leaders against their own weakness. There are colossal players who are kind of like worthy tests. When Trump says that I'm the least racist president since Abraham Lincoln, he's comparing himself against a colossal figure in the past, right? There are incredulous onlookers that I want to focus on here. And they play a key part in the act of charismatic proof itself, because in this way, certain actors can work to define and calibrate expectations about what the impossibility of the feats of this populist leader might be. Okay. And Giussi writes, this shift focuses from leaders' proofs to those who define what constitutes an amazing feat to begin with. And what I'm going to quickly illustrate here is how the drama generated from this performative ecosystem of roles and performances has the capacity to diminish civil power and allow social power to take precedence as the mode of political engagement. And I want to reiterate that it involves everyone. So it's not just the leaders and the followers of a particular populist, but those who surround them and criticize their dynamics. So let's go here. Oops. Okay. Well, we'll leave. Oh, yes. Here, these are very quickly just references. So this is a slide. I can send this to you about what I've just spoken about. This one here. Thank you. So Duterte's main opponent during the 2016 elections was a senator named Mar Rojas. And Rojas's discursive strategy was to play on the civil and uncivil moral binaries that contrasted him against Duterte, who he considered bastos, or vulgar. And he tried to demonstrate or tried to perform in some sense in the media that there was a moral pollution that Duterte would bring into government. And he characterized in his speeches, political statements, press releases, this sort of moral code where Rojas was a sacred candidate, and you can see, and the master phrase here was that he was decente, and Duterte was bastos, that he was honest, and Duterte was a liar, et cetera, et cetera. And so this tracks in some sense with what civil sphere theory suggests, that political actors want to cloak themselves in the language of liberty to establish that they have bona fides that they can lead. This is entirely my fault. Don't worry. Okay, yes, okay.
Gracias.
Okay, use the arrows. Gracias. Okay. However, audiences did not agree with Rojas's typification of himself as pure, especially being that he was the standard bearer for the previous administration and all that administration's faults. So this was seen as a little bit disingenuous. And in the paper, I have a long discussion or a thick description of a debate that Rojas and Duterte have. And the character, I'll just broadly describe this, that Rojas was trying, in some sense, to meet Duterte at his level, to try to argue with him as he would argue with him, and to present himself as a colossal figure that could match up against this populist and his bravado. And Rojas argues with Duterte and says, look, I will try to catch, basically he's trying to catch him on a technical point. You claim that the health service did not help anyone in the city that you're the mayor of. And so what if I give you a list of people who have actually been helped? Will you drop out of the race? So this is an audacious claim. Okay. And Duterte says, I can't believe you. I have clearly no one's trying to be helpful. You've never helped the city. I can prove to you all this sort of stuff. And they go back and forth about this. And the crowd is cheering. They're enjoying watching these two figures fight over this technical point and this audacious description. And then so Rojas breaks through the crowd and he speaks very loudly. He says, this is the style of Mayor Duterte. To the youth, let's not follow this example. The important thing is that is this: Mayor Duterte says something, but when presented with facts, he backtracks. He challenges Duterte again. If you can show him video evidence of someone who was helped by the health services in Davao City, will he drop out of the race? And then he says, let's see if he actually does it. He concludes, and Rojas flashes a huge smile. He thinks he's caught him in this trap. And Duterte replies, if what you are saying is true, if you've helped Filipinos, that's why you should become president. Then how come I've caught up with you in the polls, he says. And the crowd cheers because this is a tremendous point that he's made. And their supportive screams. And Duterte shrugs his shoulders, says, I don't get it. I don't understand why this person's arguing with me. The moderator tries to move the debate on, but since Duterte referenced Rojas in his remarks, she gives Rojas time to respond. And Rojas says this. He says, people are looking at your behavior, Mayor Duterte. The winner will be, and you're not worthy. On May 9th, the winner will be righteous. The winner will be decent. The winner will be worthy. And the winner will be no one else but Mar Rojas. And then off screen, Duterte says, Sus Mariosep! And the entire crowd cheers and responds. And it's a very similar phrase in Spanish to express the, I can't believe this person has said this. And Duterte declares frustration. The camera pans to him. And he looks around as if he says, I can't believe this person has said this, right? What an idiot. In this exchange, in this final word of exasperation, Sus Mariosep, Duterte turns Rojas into an unworthy challenger, unable to match his confrontational style, unable to meet what Juicy says is the performative demands of the modern mediated electoral process. In his closing statement, Rojas again insisted that dissenting Filipinos would carry the day against Duterte. But on May 9th, he says, the whole world, we will prove to the whole Philippines and around the world that there are still more decent Filipinos than there are indecent ones. But the performance had gone in Duterte's favor, and in an online poll immediately after, he had won 65% of the polling audience, saying that he had won the debate. And so the 2016 presidential election is one instance of this, where it helped audiences crystallize the emotions surrounding the state of Philippine democracy. On the one hand, you had a candidate that tried to invoke the purifying linkage between decency and democracy, but he failed in performing that in a sincere way. But that's only half the story. And when we move to Duterte's administration, we can see how social power begins to creep into the institutional world of the state, or the democracy, I should say. So, let's see. Duterte's administration evinced a distinct illiberal institutional shift, a routinization of charisma via a drug war, and its defense in the media. Extrajudicial killings operated within a performative framework by which Duterte calls attention and justifies his charismatic authority in this way. His performance in office casts media opponents and his staff in a dramatic performance of brash claims and counterclaims, dares and action, killings and bureaucratic parsing. But now with the force capacity of the state as a performative tool, Duterte's administration and his key lieutenants use the killings as a pretext and justification that they will meet the incredulous expectations of their critics with bloody effect. So in 2016, Duterte claimed, or he made the audacious declaration that he would quickly end the drug trade by killing 100,000 drug dealers and dumping their bodies in Manila Bay. Once he was in office, he actually began to make good on that promise. and poorer communities bore the brunt of state-sanctioned violence. The boldness of Duterte's claims drew in the Philippine and foreign media, as well as transnational human rights organizations. Two major reports, one by Amnesty International, the other by Human Rights Watch, detail how those in poverty had experienced the worst of the drug war and the impunity of police repression. Incredulity, surprise, and tragedy characterized these stories and reports, and Amnesty International references explicitly the 100,000 death promise as they document the extent of the drug war. Human Rights Watch quotes another claim by Duterte in which he says, "If you are still into drugs, I'm going to kill you. Don't take this as a joke, and my order is to shoot and kill you." "I don't care about human rights, you better believe me," he continues. And they use that as a framing report for their device. But in this performative structure, Duterte enhances his legitimacy using international and domestic criticism like those above, and for the context for charismatic proof. And there are three layers to this. One, Duterte positions himself as a David against a transnational Goliath. Juicy writes, "The incipient charismatic leader will likely seek colossal players out while brushing aside challenges from conventional opponents." So he insults United Nations investigator Agnes Calmard, saying, quote, "If you investigate me, I will slap you." And he attempts in this sense to cut down this colossal player to size. He attacks UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zaid Ra'ad al-Husseini, by showing that 64% of Filipinos think Duterte's cursing of the chief and members of the United Nations Human Rights Council and threatening to throw them in the river to crocodiles is vulgar, but he will do it. Against those agencies himself, Duterte embodies the Philippine nation, claiming that Philippine courts are competent enough to prosecute him, and that, quote, "I will not answer to a Caucasian asking questions or any white man there. Who are you? You must be stupid." As Juicy argues, these sorts of very plucky statements establish foreign investigators and agencies as enemies to scale to Duterte's populism. And in the context of international norms and international sanctions and institutions, this performance collapses the range of their regulatory legitimacy. At the domestic level, Duterte's sustained verbal and legal attacks against other politicians again expand the range of his legitimate authority through these types of performances. They undermine the functioning of civil institutions. For example, Duterte leveled charges against Senator Laila de Lima, who was a leading critic against the drug war. He claimed that when she was formerly Justice Secretary, she was abetting and benefiting from a drug running scheme that she ran out of a prison. On the one hand, this claim carries with it a sort of bureaucratic and reformist edge that runs through Duterte's administration, and anti-corruption is a quality of lots of populist politics. However, anti-corruption is a meaningful script that walks and talks in this performance. And so after telling the press that Duterte should stop picking on her, Duterte responds telling a crowd, quote, "If I were de Lima, ladies and gentlemen, I would hang myself," which triggered cheers from the audience. In terms of her charismatic counter role, de Lima was not cast as an equal, but as an unworthy challenger. But just as the exercise of this performance, you have to sort of fire the gun if you're thinking about it in terms of a play, like a Chekhov play. If you have the object in the first scene, you have to play it out in the third scene. Duterte eventually orders de Lima's arrest on corruption and drug running. And by arresting de Lima, the direct institutional effect is one of diminishing institutional autonomy of checks and balances by the opposition. The key takeaway here is that he followed through on his threats, which in performative terms is the denouement to charismatic drama. In Weberian terms, it's the deployment of force. Dos minutos? Okay, I will have to summarize very quickly. It's social power that begins to occlude civil power by a contentious performance, which again provides the context for charismatic proof. So I will quickly talk about this section here. These are the headlines. Duterte's lieutenants also perform a form of this charism as he passes on to them a little bit of his charisma. And when local media and international human rights organizations criticize him, his presidential spokesperson says, actually, you don't understand what he's saying. He's from the south of the Philippines, and he speaks in a very different way. His legal counsel says, actually, if you listen to what he said specifically, he's against extrajudicial killings. And so the media respond, we cannot believe that these people are making these statements and claims, right? And so they reply in headlines and in their text that it's impossible to get through to these people. His police chief, who's a bit more in his style, when pushed on whether or not he had participated in extrajudicial killing, said, if you prove it, that I have performed an extrajudicial killing, I will cut off my own head. And then he drags his thumb across his neck, and he does it twice in this press conference. And so he dares the press to try to prove that he's done something wrong. And I'm saying all of this to suggest that as the response from media rises, that there is an incredulity behind all of these claims and these actions. The very sad part and very tragic part is that this state actually executes these plans. And so it's, in some sense, not very helpful when the context for performance here of incredulity and of what a populist or what a charismatic leader says they're going to do, it becomes very difficult to sort of rein them back, especially when they have state power. So in conclusion, all I want to suggest is that maybe this is not a new story, it's really the story of Weber. But contra Weber, charisma can be routinized in a bureaucratic way through performance, and that these performances undermine the capacity of civil power to surround social power. Right? And what we might be seeing here is less a quality of different groups referencing the same sorts of cultural codes, but rather what Alexander called many years ago columnization, where you have basically two different cultures operating in simultaneous time, but observing the same performances, not understanding what's happening. So I hope civil sphere theory, and I do think civil sphere theory has the capacity to make explicit these dark sides of democracy and its possibility as it slides to authoritarianism, and that we can work on trying to figure out how this happens in other cases as well. Thank you for the extra time.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you. Thanks so much. Now we will welcome Juan Camilo Portela from Universidad de Antioquia, who will comment the presentation of Professor Celso.
Dr. Villegas, thank you very much for your presentation. I find it very stimulating and inspiring. In previous work, Dr. Villegas has explored into how cultural construction of middle classes participate in civil sphere. I view this presentation, this current presentation, as one additional step that delved how social power are related with civil power, and warns, Dr. Villegas warns how the civil sphere can contribute to its own weakening in the face of social power. I appreciate that the analytical keys that this presentation give about the performative dynamics of populism that could be applied on other cases in Latin America as well as in other countries. For example, just a days ago, Bukele started its second period in El Salvador, and I would say that many of the aspects of the performative model, in particular the counter roles that Dr. Villegas presents, maybe will be present in these cases. In addition to contributing to the understanding of populist dynamics, these ideas are useful in the study of the role of social movements, radicalism, and violence as phenomena influencing the modification of relationships between social and civil power. I would like to make 3 specific comments to this presentation with a set of questions. First, some developments in civil sphere theory, particularly in Latin America and in Southern Asia, emphasize the role of cultural structures that compete with the civil code in the struggle for social legitimacy. For example, patrimonial, corporate, hacienda codes revolutionary militant or Chavista codes, support challenges to civil sphere, and give rise to concrete forms of institutionalization and power constructions. When addressing populism, it is argued, like you do, that it is built on a specific cultural code that oppose elite people, and one claim is that this cultural structure can respond to tensions in the civil sphere. But at the same time, populism can draw from discourses that compete with the civil code, like I mentioned before. Populist performs stage scripts that update non-civil backgrounds representations. An example may be patrimonialism in Latin America, in Mexico in particular, or the liberal memory culture in Germany. And in Duterte's case, as you say, indicators are the Goliath David narrative, the Jesus Maria Jose exclamation, Sus Marillos, as well as human rights denials and a race code. As you say, you use the concept of columnization to highlight the difficulty of civilly containing populism due to the competition between cultural codes. A strong civil critique can be subverted through its translation into a populist narrative. My question in this first topic is how can we understand the role of non-civil codes in your performance model? In particular, what do you think is the role of critics from non-civil codes play in this performative model? And related with that, if you see some ways in populism, the terrorism from within. My two other commentaries are shorter. The second is the existence of a sacred center whose erosion would threaten the civil sphere's existence helps define criteria to identify or distinguish constructive to destructive forms of populism. The inability to limit social powers, as you say, social powers intrusion, as you say, into state institutions indicate destructive populist advances. In particular, it involves a routinization of charisma. It's a very interesting point that you do, which, as seen in Duterte's case, can lead to be fed through dangerous spirals of necropolitics, to use an strange word for this theoretical approach. Here I have one question, considering the Latin American experience. Discussing how populism erodes democracy seems to overlook the civil sphere dark side, and you recognize the importance of this dark side, giving the impression that institutions were clearly civil before the eruption of populism. I know that is not the case, but I appreciate if you elaborate a little bit more. How do you understand the dark side of the civil sphere in your work? And the final commentary is in the text that I have read. You explicitly express that it's necessary to put in words our frustration with the elements of civil sphere, reminding us that the civil sphere is a theory that should project hope. And you suggest that defining democracy cannot be built solely, and I quote, based on exhortations to decency, cultivating feelings of disgust and disbelief, not relying on the rational, irrational binary code. In this sense, you propose the opinion or understanding of how the civil participates in columnization and the strengthening of social power. My question, my last question, is guided by practical anxieties, and is how do you imagine we can defend democracy without simultaneously giving oxygen to the fight of populism and authoritarianism? Thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
We will leave the comments and questions after the next presentation.
Oh, okay.
Yes, and afterwards, after we can hear our next speaker. After our next presentation, after the next speaker, we will have a moment for questions and comments. So let's wait a little. Yes. So now we will start with the presentation of Professor Jeffrey Alexander, Professor of Sociology and Coordinator of the Center of Cultural Sociology of Yale University, at Yale University. So, Professor, we hear you.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I wish I could have been there in person. The title of my presentation, I've shortened it, so it's now The Political Party Between Democracy and Dictatorship. The Roman-obsessed creators of the American Constitution devised a set of structures and institutions to protect their revolutionary exercise in self-government, not just from the external danger of kingship, but from the internal danger of democracy. Alexander Hamilton worried during a debate at the Constitutional Convention, quote, "The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right." In designing the American version of republicanism, however, the constitutional founders in the United States put too much weight on separating governing institutions without regard to the full panoply of the civil sphere's communicative and regulative institutions, and gave too much regard to the gullibility of mass emotion without regard to the psychic reservoirs of and discursive insistence upon critical autonomy. They also failed entirely to mention what would become the most significant threat to modern democracy, which is the political party. Failing to theorize meaning-making in the civil sphere, America's founders failed to understand the central role of political parties in shaping it. In what follows, I want to take some preliminary steps towards doing so. I view the political party as a conduit for meaning-making and a bridge across which constructed public opinion shapes into state power. Party is the crucial institutional vehicle for crystallizing symbolic meanings ideologically, that is, in a power-oriented way. Political parties are constitutive of a thriving democracy, enriching and empowering the civil sphere in its relationship to the state. They are also, however, constitutive or can be of dictatorship. Having emerged from within the civil sphere, political parties can turn back upon it. They can employ state power to insert party ideology back into the civil sphere, undermining the ideational autonomy, its ideational autonomy, and preventing open-ended democratic mobilization. The group is a sui generis social phenomenon whose nature has typically not been of interest to sociologists, but to social psychology. I'm taking the political party as a quintessentially a group phenomenon. So I want to talk a bit about about this notion of a group before I come back to political parties. Rather than thematizing the group, sociologists have primarily conceptualized it as a neutral container for various forms of social feeling, primary and secondary groups, peer groups, gangs, religious sects, trade unions, and political parties. By contrast, from the perspective of a more individual-focused, emotionally sensitive disciplines, the notion of the group has been subject to continuous and sometimes even venomous analytical deconstruction. For example, during the fin de siècle, Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd equated the existence of a group with flowing mass emotions that wipe out rationality and autonomy. Quote, "The masses have never thirsted after the truth," Le Bon wrote. "Whoever can supply them with illusions is really their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always a victim." In the despairing wake of the First World War, the American social psychologist William McDougall elaborated these ideas in his book, The Group Mind. Sigmund Freud peered into the structure of what he called artificial groups like the church and army, and argued that their very existence depended upon regressive, primitive, and largely unconscious motivations, on fear-based deference to father leaders, and supine fantasies about mother love. When conservative social theorists like Gaetano Mosca developed their anti-democratic understandings of elite reproduction, they did so by passing through this circuit of group theory. The notion that modern society constituted a simple mass of disconnected individuals followed from this. From Ortega y Gasset to Hannah Arendt to William Kornhauser, so-called mass society theory underscored the ancient Republican fear that democracy is unsustainable. Robert Michel's famous brilliant Italian student drew from this intellectual tradition in his masterpiece, Political Parties. Studying the German Social Democratic Party in the early years of the 20th century, Michel's claimed to have demonstrated the existence of what he called the iron law of oligarchy. It was a decidedly pseudo-psychological theory, but it perceptively pointed to a very disturbing empirical fact, namely that groups have a marked tendency to become hierarchical and anti-democratic. Despite its often deterministic pessimism, group theory remains deeply relevant, I think, if a more sociological and less reductively social psychological effort is made to better understand the nature of political parties. Contemporary cultural sociology, for example, would connect deference and loving loyalty to the power of the collective representations that give meaning to group life, compelling group members to continuously spin out homologies that iterate hateful and loving antinomies between the sacred and profane. Party groups are bound by binary ideologies that identify the sacred with their own collective ideals and the profane with the ideals of the parties struggling against them. Of course, elections are key regulatory institutions of civil spheres, establishing the link between civil sphere meanings and the reforming and sanctioning policies of government. Political parties, in turn, are critical to elections. They crystallize the structures of feeling swirling through civil spheres in a manner that can effectively transform cultural representation into votes, such that civil sentiments can become represented in the state. Without the simplifying function of political parties, how would a voter ever be able to choose one policy from another? As materially embodied collective representations, parties simplify and crystallize ideologies, providing shifters like left and right that seamlessly link symbolic meaning to concrete social policies. You might say that parties are materialized collective representations that create cultural shifters, generating loyalty and deference for themselves and a visceral hostility to those on the outside. Yet if parties are the necessary regulative institutions of democratic, are among the necessary regulative institutions of democratic civil spheres, the intensely divisive ideological antagonisms they inspire also make them the most fragile. When a political party plays by the democratic rules, wins massive support in a political election, and places its party members and ideological affiliates into key positions inside the state, it becomes exposed to dangerous opportunities for democratic deformation. Parties in power are tempted to challenge the civil capacities of other regulatory institutions, questioning, for example, the universal obligations that office imposes on power holders to exercise authority in a disinterested manner on behalf not of themselves, but of the civil sphere. I'll talk about this tomorrow. Parties in power may also be tempted to challenge the rule of law, the precedent following universalizing civil norms that independent judges and lawyers interpret and remake. Parties are bridges between civil sphere and state, but sometimes parties pull the bridge up behind them after they ascend into the state. Adhering to the powerful ideology that allowed them to win state power, they fervently believe social policies derived from their ideology to be the only valid guide for the state. It's imperative to conceptualize the links between political party and civil sphere in a more complex and nuanced manner, one that can envision a range of outcomes between democracy and dictatorship. So maybe if you can put that slide on the screen. I asked Nelson if it would become possible. If it's not, it's okay. I developed a simple cross-tabulation that reveals 4 ideal typical possibilities. There you go. That's fine. It's gone now, though. Yeah. Okay, that's good. So this is a simple cross-tabulation that reveals 4 ideal typical possibilities of parties. In theory, these differ dramatically, which of course is the point of ideal types, but empirically they have fuzzy boundaries that bleed into one another. Loose parties can be understood as microcosms of the civil sphere. They sustain neither self-reproducing oligarchies nor rigid ideologies. Rather than aiming to seize state power, loose parties bend it to serve the ideological tilt of their own side. In loose parties, party members conduct meetings in the light of day. The party debates are covered and interpreted by independent journalists and put to the test via public opinion polls. Party policies are open to challenge by other civil associations. Party ambitions are transparent and accessible to the civil sphere. Party debates are governed by constitutional rules and conducted according to elaborate interactional civilities, such as those described in Robert's Rules of Order. Contests for party leadership are followed avidly by the broad public and influenced by non-party publics. And winners are chosen according to the votes party members cast in free and fair elections. For all of these reasons, the looseness of parties can be interpreted as contributing to civil sphere values and practices. Looseness is also interpreted, however, as preventing a party's effectiveness, as inhibiting the representation and mobilization that gets out votes and transforms ideologies into state power. The pressure to become better at such activities can lead parties to tighten. A more tightly organized party becomes more effective organizationally and more limpid ideologically, and thus perhaps more effective at motivating voters. Parties can become tighter if they hire, for example, more dedicated full-time staff, if they organize party youth groups and develop career pathways for young activists to become adult party officials, if they develop clear ideological guidelines, etc. Such tightening moves political parties downward in the box, from loose to tight. But it doesn't necessarily move them rightward into a more personalistic, hierarchical, and potentially anti-civil direction. For example, the tightly organized and professional parties that play such significant roles in many European countries' electoral politics, the British Tory and Labour parties, the German Christian Democrats, Greens, and Social Democrats, belie that there is an inherent move to the right, as there's a movement downward from loose to tight. Yet it is a challenge of effectivity to get better at bringing an ideologically relevant slice of civil sentiment into the state that often triggers not only tightening, but also the rightward movement toward personalization and verticality of political parties. Insofar as organizers believe that the very existence of their party is threatened, for example, by what they think of as unfounded rumor, punitive legal judgment, or violent and conspiratorial state authority, they will become more secretive, less open to civil scrutiny, more hierarchical, and even violent, and they will begin to conduct themselves in a more military than a civil style. These kinds of fears and demands for greater efficiency triggered the world historical creation of the Bolshevik Party in 1903, when Vladimir Lenin broke with the Mensheviks, accusing them of passive economic determinism and organizational vulnerability. Against the Mensheviks' commitment to a looser party of broad membership, Lenin insisted that only a highly centralized party, a highly centralized and smaller party of professional revolutionaries, would be able to confront and defeat the Tsarist state. It was the creation of this new kind of organizational weapon that allowed Lenin to seize state power just 15 years later. And the global impact of the Russian Revolution of 1917 conferred extraordinary prestige on the vertical and often viciously anti-democratic party model that he had invented. By closely emulating the Russian model, Mussolini's fascists and Hitler's Nazis were able to instigate right-wing anti-democratic revolutions that mirrored Lenin's own in many ways, physically eliminating their opposition and creating police states. Instead of crystallizing public opinion in a manner that would allow civil entry into the state, what Antonio Gramsci called the modern prince deployed state power to hypodermically inject Marxist-Leninist or fascist ideology into the civil sphere. While such vanguard parties putatively represent the will of the people, they suppress the autonomy of communicative institutions that would allow its critical reinterpretation. They repress the civil associations that might contest the will of the people as they see it. They undermine the aggregation of disinterested polls that enumerate social opinions and manipulate electoral processes that would allow competing parties and their ideologies to enter the state. Vertical political parties demand obsequiousness. Belief, obey, fight was the fascist credo under Mussolini. Not only from their own members, but from office holders who exercise power on behalf of the state. Eventually, such vertical organization produces a cult of personality, a pseudo-charismatic performative vehicle for exerting dictatorial authority. Tight parties become inward-looking, focusing their collective representations on a totem, a single leading figure like Mao, a tiny inner group like the Standing Committee of the CCP, or a small ideological cookbook like Mao's Little Red Book. Between such tight party dictatorship and more loosely organized political parties that serve the civil sphere, there are, of course, a range of semi-authoritarian mass parties like Narendra Modi's BJP, Vladimir Putin's United Russia, and Recep Erdogan's AKP that demand domestic obsequiousness and endanger democracy in the world today. There are occasions, however, and this is what I'll end up this discussion with, there are occasions when the movement goes the other way, when tight parties face demands to loosen. In this case, pressure emerges not from a need for greater control and effectiveness, but from a need to be more responsive to voices and movements in the civil sphere itself. For 150 years, political parties in the United States were controlled by upper-class elites who secreted themselves in proverbial smoke-filled rooms. In 1968, the months-long anti-war candidacies of Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy had persuaded President Lyndon Johnson not to seek re-election. But instead of acceding to the anti-war mood of the American civil sphere, Democratic Party elites at the Chicago nominating convention handpicked President Johnson's pro-war vice president, Hubert Humphrey, to be the party's candidate. Unable to materialize the anti-war enthusiasm among Democratic voters, Humphrey went down to defeat in the general election, with Republican Richard Nixon being elected instead. This loss triggered the creation of a Democratic Party Reform Commission, which ensured that all future party candidates would be elected via open state-level primary elections rather than by party bigwigs behind closed doors. This loosening was dramatic, and it allowed outsider candidates of little experience and prior political recognition like Barack Obama and Donald Trump to gain nominations and win elections by virtue of their extraordinary performative power. Because President Obama had anchored his political identity to America's democratic and solidarizing traditions, during his 8 years in power, the loosened Democratic Party remained inside the upper left quadrant. In other words, loose and on the civil sphere side. Trump's 4 years in power, however, produced a very different result. A real estate tycoon enraged by backlash and untethered from civil sphere, Trump led the loosened Republican Party into the upper right quadrant, to the personalistic and vertical side. The consequence, in the words of the liberal British magazine, The Economist, is that the party has been, quote, walking away from democracy ever since. Nothing could more clearly demonstrate the centrality of political parties to democratic regulation, and at the same time, how vulnerable parties are to the efforts of authoritarian leaders. Observing Republicans abandoning democracy, The Economist called for the parties democratic reformation, even as it acknowledged, quote, this renewal is impossible for as long as Mr. Trump remains the Republican Party's leader, adding, quote, that is another way of saying that the direction of the Republican Party is tied up with the fate of one man. Indeed, it is. And that's why group theory is necessary to understand tight political parties and the anti-democratic dangers they face. Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you. Buenos días. Good morning. I am very happy to be here with you today and to be part of this dialogue in which we will essay to address a concern that has become more and more relevant in the public debate. What is happening to democracies across the world? To say that in broad terms, finding an answer to this question and to the other questions encapsulated in it is not easy. Explaining, for example, the link between autocratic processes, populism, and the erosion of democracy in a way that constitutes more than an alarm bell requires a profound understanding of the civil sphere culture and its institutions. So thank you, Professor Nelson, for the invitation and for gathering us to reflect on this matter. Professor Alexander, I found your presentation very interesting. Thank you. Academic discussions about public parties, their configuration, how they interact with each other, and their articulation with specific government policies, among many other aspects, have been at the heart of democratic theory for many years. It is well known, for example, that political parties are fundamental for good democratic functioning since they enrich and empower the civil sphere. However, history has shown us that parties are also constitutive of dictatorships. How is this possible? In what Professor Jeff has explained, I found a concrete answer to this question. Parties build bridges between the civil sphere and the state, but sometimes they pull the bridge upon behind them after they ascend into the state. That means even though they have emerged from within the civil sphere, political parties can turn back upon it and employ state power to insert party ideology back into the civil sphere, undermining its ideonational autonomy. So, regarding what you have shared with us today, Professor Jeff, I would like to highlight the following. We must recognize, as you have explained, that political parties are both a conduit for meaning-making or meaning-making groups and for state power. These two main characteristics, I would say, or maybe they are more like circuits with where they perform. I'm not sure. You may, maybe you can help me understand this. These two main characteristics shape parties' fragility. Professor Jeb has explained that parties are the most fragile regulative institutions in democratic civil sphere. Understanding their fragility may help us see why they have become a significant threat to modern democracies. As he has explained, as materially embodied collective representations, parties simplify and crystallize ideologies, providing cultural shifters like left and right that seamlessly link symbolic meaning to concrete policies. This generates loyalty and deference for themselves and visceral hostility to those on the outside. In this way, party groups are bound by binary ideologies that identify the sacred with their collective ideals and the profane with the ideals of the parties struggling against them. Nonetheless, political parties are vulnerable to this divisive ideological antagonism they inspire. As Professor Jeff has said, when a political party that has played by democratic rules won massive support and has placed its ideological affiliations in key positions inside the state, it becomes exposed to dangerous opportunities for democratic deformation. Adhering to the powerful ideology that allows them to win state power, they may fervently believe social policies derived from their ideology to be the only valid guide for the state. Parties in power may be tempted to challenge the civil capacities of other regulatory institutions, and by doing so, they insert party ideological codes in the civil sphere that erode democratic institutions and set the scenery for autocratic processes. So looking into how these two characteristics or circuits articulate or interact with each other, considering a little bit of group theory, as Professor Jeff has mentioned, may help us understand how this vulnerability, how this fragility expresses itself as a specific link between civil sphere meanings and the reforming and sanctioning policies of government. This articulation happens in an intricate but kind of fuzzy way, and from what I've understood of what he has said, it's not linear or one-way directed, to say it in better words, and it is not the same for every democracy. That's why, as Professor Jeff has shown, it is crucial to conceptualize the links between political parties and the civil sphere in a complex and subtle manner, one that can envision a range of outcomes between democracy and dictatorship. Here is where the cross-tabulation model proposed by Professor Jeff is valuable and comes in useful. It reveals four typical ideal possibilities that may help us observe this empirically, reflecting on whether parties sustain or not self-reproducing oligarchies and rigid ideologies, so to maintain or not civil solidarity and political animism while rejecting antagonism. By doing so, this cross-tabulation model will help us observe a continuum between democratic and dictatorship practices via the party system. Well, having said that, having highlighted those points, now I would like to ask you, Professor Jeff, a few questions that hopefully may be useful to begin or to continue our dialogue. First, since political parties are representative of collective meaning, would you say that they have or perform iconic power? If they do, can the relationship between the civil sphere and political parties be expressed or seen in an iconic way linked to civil solidarity? Second, how are minorities represented or included in these symbolic meaning processes where the political parties play a central role in shaping? And finally, is there a way to reduce the vulnerability of political parties to divisive ideological antagonism they inspire? I mean, is there a way to strengthen the parties so they may resist the temptation of engaging in democratic deformation? Thank you.
Thank you, Amber. Now we have some time for some comments and questions, and to keep the conversation going with our speakers and also with the comments with the people that commented their work. So while you get inspired, the audience gets inspired. Yeah, we hear you. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all presenters. I'm Raúl Pacheco Vega. I'm a professor here at FLACSO. I do study civil society, but I do not study authoritarianism. So it was very, very nice to hear all of your presentations. I think one of the central threads that I've seen, I've read some of your work, Celso, before, and I think part of what has successfully fractured the way in which Mexican politics is happening right now is precisely something that you actually wrote about, linking the work of Jeff with yours, on how race is part of this civil sphere and so on. And it feels to me as though we've lost the plot in some ways here in Mexico. We just had a general election, as you know. And it is true, one of my colleagues, Johan Gordillo, mentioned that one of the key to the success of current President Claudia Sheinbaum was the fact that the way in which they mobilized imitated the tools and repertoires of civil society. This is super interesting to me because what you presented on Duterte and what Jeff presented as well on these fractures seems to me to indicate that people in power can actually imitate civil society in their tools and repertoires and techniques. And this imitation actually forces opposing parties and opposing, people in the opposition to rethink the way they're going to approach it. Because the way we see civil society, the way we analyze civil society, it's sort of, civil society as good, as a public good even. But I just wanted to reflect on that. And I would like to ask the panelists to reflect on this, because it really seems to me as though now we have to really rethink how we're going to do elections in the future.
Thank you. Also, if, si necesitan apoyo con la traducción para alguna pregunta o algo así, pues díganos, y aquí estamos para apoyar a quien quiera hacer alguna pregunta en español. And also online, if there is some questions for the audience, we are here, no? Someone else? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation, for this space. I have two questions. The first is for Celso and Juan Camilo, and the second is for Amber and for Jeffrey. The first question is about this process, this transition from the social camp to the political camp. How we can think the transition from the societal camp, in which we can find sentiments, demands, narratives, to the performative of the state agents. Because one thing that Professor Celso mentioned is that the state agents mobilize political meaning in order to legitimize power. So we can find this process. And the second question is how we can think about the actors, not the political parties, the social actors that put political meanings in the dispute of the power.
Okay, good, thanks. Someone else? ¿Alguien más? No? Okay, so let's begin with Celso, por favor.
Thank you for your questions, and Juan, thank you so much for your really challenging points that I have to do a little bit of this to try to solve some of the problems. So these are really important, and I think I also appreciate that you've read my other work, which is, no one's ever said that. My students don't even read my papers, so that's nice. The thing I want to say is that I'm trained as a Latin Americanist by training, and I backed into studying the Philippines. So a lot of I think in a comparative way and thinking about Latin American cases across this way. So part of what I think is really valuable about our discussion is that there is a tradition of comparison, right, that it's missing in some sense from civil sphere theory. And we've done this work already to try to pull stuff out, but not explicitly say, here are the major things that we need to point out, right? So to your first question, Juan, how do we understand the role of non-civil codes in the performance model? I think my ambition here was a little bit more narrow, because I wanted to try to describe what the change in state looks like. So when you have two competing codes, or the dissolution of a civil code, what does that feel like when you know that you might be at the edge of from refraction to colonization, right? So I think the next step would be to try to figure out what that might be. But it also opens the door to what kind of comparisons we can make. So, we haven't done this work comparing the revolutionary code in Venezuela versus the Hacienda code, right? I mean, what is that, trajectories, all this sort of stuff. So in some ways, we've done the groundwork of establishing what the codes are, but we haven't done the comparative historical work to see whether they lead in different directions. So I think that's the next step. So that's my half answer to that question. The second question you have was a really good one too, about, where are we here? The sacred center, and maybe it came across as a strong assumption that institutions were already democratic or civil beforehand. So what I like about civil sphere theory, and coming at this from a perspective of studying the Philippines and Latin America, is that I've been trained not to agree with anything that seems like modernization theory. So I have to take out of my head the idea that all good things go together. And similarly, I want to take out of my head that all bad things go together too. And so I think part of the thing that is exhibited in cases where you have an eruption of civil behavior, even though you have long sort of ranges of repression, is that there's still a little bit of a kernel left. And so in the paper, I'm trying to demonstrate what it looks like when one particular set of institutions undermines itself. It doesn't mean that other institutions cannot, in the future, become capacitated, right? And so when I think about the value of the vote in Chile, for instance, the second referendum was effective despite the fact that parties were, I mean, so there's possibilities where each of these institutions may have its own leverage, and because of the way that they're connected, may have some opportunities. So that's what I would say here, is that not all bad things go together too. And I guess I might have described nightmare scenarios, but I think you're right that that Bukele and Duterte are very close in comparison, right? I think Bukele just a couple weeks ago stood in front of his bureaucrats and said, well, I'm going to arrest all of you. And I mean, and he did it, which is the other part of the challenge. And so I'm trying to demonstrate when you get a hold of state power, the worst case scenario is that person actually deploys it and does it in a very powerful performative way, right? And it proves that they're capable of doing this and there's no stopping them, right? But that's one bad thing, and there may still be other good things, right? And so this question about, well, can this provide any tools to try to capacitate or fight against these sorts of forms of colonization? I have another half answer to this. One is to say that, and I think this is coming off maybe a version of your question, Raul, where non-civil actors imitate civility. I think it's a big mistake for civil actors to imitate populism, because in some ways they can't compete. At least in the Philippine case, it doesn't demonstrate this, right? And that one thing that's really useful is that, I think in some instances, incredulity in the press does reinforce charismatic power. It doesn't mean that you should give up on criticism, because that will still be a resource in the long run, right? But that particular combination of having someone with the will to execute state power on behalf of force and criticism is not a great combination, I'd say. So that's one negative pairing. So I think that's my solution to that. And maybe a half answer to your question, Raul, about imitation too.
Thanks so much, Professor Alexander. We hear you. Please.
Well, I think that I'd respond to Ambar a little bit. In terms of iconic power, I guess that insofar as there's a cult of personality, that's where I'd see iconicity coming into political parties, which is the pictures like of the famous leaders behind every speech, for example. There's a lot of iconographic work that can be done. I've been reading about Mussolini lately, and you can see his face changing iconographically and how important his face was to the grip of the fascist party. You can look at Mabel Berrezin's work on also parades and marches during Mussolini's reign as something interesting. I guess you could say that the longer or more powerful a tight vertical party is, the more you'd expect it to move from social power and discursive power to iconic power. About the question of minorities, I don't know. I don't. Apparently, like AMLO is his party is identified with indigenous people or more dark-skinned people. This is, of course, a giant issue in all political parties. The racial element, the minority element, the minority religious element. I don't know anything about that in particular. How to reduce the dangers? Well, it seems to me that the pressure should be to try to make tight parties more loose. So you could, people could demand open meetings of parties. They could ask for the minutes of parties meetings to be revealed, for everybody to know as much as they can about what happens inside. And I know in your situation that you're about to enter into, you have a kind of an extraordinary situation where one party has beaten another party like 2-1, which is a massively dangerous situation, and where the relationship between the elected president and the charismatic party founder is mysterious and obscure. So I would demand as much transparency as possible. I have other things I could talk about, but I think I've taken enough time.
Someone else? We still have like a few minutes left. No? Sí, sí.
Thank you. A general question: what will be the role of church, religions, security forces, but in particular paramilitary power? It's the case of the colleague, the first, and also the markets, in particular drugs and guns, the international markets of drugs and guns, in this relationship between state and civil sphere.
Should I try? Okay, I'll try to answer this question. Says thinking about Venezuela is one of my other cases too, and where I think if we think about and the response to the question here about what we might think about social power for performance, right? I think if we're thinking in cultural sociological terms, the state and its capacity for force is a performance tool, not simply by putting on a production, but as part of the actual action, the performative actions of states, right, to kill someone or to take them and detain them. I think in a case where a state is no longer directly, or its security forces are no longer directly funded by, or partially funded by taxes, and are then funded by black markets and other forms, then it's hard to rein that in through public policy in some sense. My guess from what I've heard about the state of the Maduro government is that there are some generals that would otherwise be inclined to push him out, but want to secure up their own base, their economic base before they go, and whether or not they're willing to go into conflict dealing with their relationship with drug running and with arms from Brazil. And so that's what's holding back his willingness to step down peacefully. But I mean, in some sense, no, those are all questions of social power. They're not questions of civil sphere power. And I think the Venezuela case is a remarkable one too, because there's international pressure, but again, it's one of these contexts where a leader can say, look, the US really hates me, so I'm going to continue to do bad things. And it reinforces their charismatic position, right? And this is not even civil sphere theory. There are folks who study the effect of sanctions, and they say they're actually quite bad on non-democratic regimes. But if we think about it in civil sphere theory, then it's a tool for performance. That's why they're bad, is that you generate charisma from them. So I think that's my answer to that question.
I don't know if you have something. No, Amber. No.
Can I make one comment on that?
Of course.
That adding to what Celso just said in response to the previous question, that is, it shows, the famous Weberian argument that there has to be a monopolization of violence by the state to have a, quote, modern social system. And I think you have to have the monopolization of violence to have an effective civil sphere. Of course, that doesn't mean it's a democrat. It's not sufficient. So the state can monopolize violence, but you still would need a democracy. I mean, but when you have paramilitary violence and you have drug gangs and cartels, that are self-financing and have their markets in extra-national places, the tremendous challenge is that the state does not have a monopolization of violence. And to me, that's a critical problem in Mexico, obviously, in Venezuela and other countries. So how can you have a very effective civil sphere control over a state when the state itself isn't in control of the means of violence?
Well, thanks so much, Professor, and our speakers. We are on time. We have the next session. And we have some, nos tomamos unos minutos para, sí, para. Regresamos a la una, sí. Hasta la una. Okay. Bueno, gracias. Thanks so much for your presence and for your inspiring presentations. Gracias. Thank you. ¿Tenemos una hora? Se acabó muy rápido.
Thank you, Jeff, for your speech. Thank you very much.
We're meeting at 3 o'clock, 1 o'clock your time after lunch.